Okay, how you doing everyone? Welcome to this lecture on the Paralympic athlete. Today we're going to talk about classification in Paralympic sports. So we'll discuss topics like what is classification, why is it important, why do we have different classification systems, what are the steps involved in getting an athlete classified, and what are the different sport classes. So first off, let's talk about what is classification. Well, it's really, really important because classification underlies all Paralympic sports, but yet the concept and its practical application is probably one of the greatest barriers to the wider community understanding Paralympic sport. People often find it confusing because there's such a complicated classification system. Basically, what the system does is how it functions is that it is a process of allocating athletes into classes so that they can compete against others whose impairment affects them to a similar degree in their sport. So it's similar to grouping athletes in able-bodied sport by age, by weight, or by gender. And the idea is that it ensures a fair and level playing field for all competitors. And the ideal is that it ensures that winning is determined by skill, fitness, power, endurance, technical and tactical ability, and mental focus. So, for example, if we just bring it back out of Paralympic sport and into able-bodied sport, there are sports that have classification systems. So, for example, in boxing, it would not be fair to have a heavyweight boxer who's 90 kilos plus competing against a flyweight boxer who weighs a maximum of 50 kilos. The weight advantage there would offer such a significant performance advantage to the heavyweight that there would essentially be no competition. And that's before we even consider any of the safety aspects of it. Likewise, we classify athletes according to their age. So you wouldn't expect a 14-year-old sprinter to be able to compete against a fully grown adult sprinter. So we have age classifications in sports. We also have classifications according to sex. So you would not want a biological male competing against a biological female in rugby because, again, the biological males will have certain advantages that would make it unfair for them to compete against the females and unsafe for them to compete against the females. So classification in Paralympic sport is a more complex system, but that tries to achieve the same thing. We want fairness and a level playing field for all competitors, and we want to ensure that winning is determined by skill, fitness, power, endurance, technical and tactical ability, and mental focus, and not some other factor that could be levelled out. So, there are a couple of different ways that athletes can be classified, a couple of different classification systems. We know that the Paralympic movement originated in the 1940s, and it was an extension of the rehabilitation process for soldiers who were injured in war. During the early years of the Paralympic movement, because of this, how it originated, the classification system was medically based. So it looked at the organisational structure of the rehabilitation hospital, and they divvied up separate classes for people who had spinal cord injuries, a separate class for people who had amputations, and then separate classes for other people with neurological or orthopaedic conditions. It tried to come up with a level playing field, and it did start to put some organisation on things. However, it wasn't concerned with the functional ability of the athlete. And of course, we could have two athletes who have a leg amputation, but their functional ability can be very different based on where the amputation takes place. For example, is the amputation below the knee or is the amputation above the knee? An athlete who has an amputation below the knee, so still has a knee joint and some functioning limb below the knee, will have a greater functional ability than an athlete who has an above the knee amputation. So therefore, this original medically classified definition by are you an amputee or are you not an amputee went some way to start in the process, but it is not particularly a suitable process, and it hindered the playing field for many athletes because their ability or their functional ability wasn't taken into account. So examples of medical classifications are how much vision an athlete with a visual disability has, the level of a spinal cord injury, or the location of an amputation. Another way of classifying Paralympic athletes is based on their functional capacity. So how well the athlete performs specific sport skills, which of course is sport specific. So this is in contrast to the medical classification approach, in which athletes would compete in the same class for all sports. This functional system of classification is sport specific. So this is because any given impairment may have a significant impact in one sport and a relatively minor example in another sport. So we'll go back to the amputation example, but this time we're going to talk about an arm amputation. If an athlete has a below the elbow amputation, it's going to have a fairly big impact on their ability to swim. But an athlete with a below the elbow arm amputation, it's going to have a relatively minor impact on their ability to run a marathon. So talking about an arm amputation below the elbow, if you have an arm amputation below the elbow, your ability to swim is going to be greatly impacted. Your ability to run a long distance is not going to be impacted to the same degree. So these functional classification systems, would place an athlete with that below the elbow amputation in a different class for swimming than they would for athletics. The functional classification system is currently the most used sports classification, with the exception of athletes who compete in blind sports. That is still they still use the medical classification for blind athletes. There are issues with the classification system. It's not perfect. In many cases, there's an absence of relevant scientific evidence to back up the reasons that athletes are grouped according to functional ability within their sports. The classification system is based on expert opinions. So within each of the sports, senior Paralympic classifiers from a diverse range of backgrounds lead the development of the functional systems classification. There are medical classifiers, so they are doctors, physiotherapists who must be obviously suitably professionally qualified, and then operate to determine how they think the disability is going to affect the functional ability of the athlete. Then there's technical classifiers, and these technical classifiers are candidates who have qualifications, for example, a bachelor's or a master's degree in sports science, physical education, kinesiology, human movement science, or the like, plus major education in the specific sport of interest. So they've got the two areas covered off there. So to determine the functional classification, it would be based on on a group of expert opinions from the medical classifiers and from the technical classifiers. We've got a good paper here from the International Paralympic Committee, which provides the background and the scientific principles of classification in Paralympic sport. So it's important to note that it's not perfect, but the IPC are doing their very best to make sure it's as good as possible. So they tried to outline the scientific background for classification in sport. They define what evidence-based classification is. It provides guidelines for how evidence-based classification may be achieved, and gives scientific value and regulations. For example, it's a code that is put in place for the regulators to follow. There are some controversies surrounding classification, and issues always come up where there are athletes saying that the playing field is not level. In some circumstances, they will go so far as to say that there's gaming of the classification system, which compares to doping in sport as well, with athletes over-exaggerating the extent of their disabilities in order to be put into different functional classes where they will have a better chance of success. There's plenty of interviews out there. And there's one podcast and interview that we're going to put up available on Moodle with you guys. In 2015, a very high-profile British Paralympian withdrew from sport over the classification. Bethany Woodward, who has cerebral palsy and competed in London in 2012, had withdrew from Team GB so that she could speak out on the issue. She told in the Sunday Times interview, she said she had lost faith in the team, with some of her fellow teammates she felt were unfairly abusing the classification system. So there's some interesting stuff for you guys to read and follow up on there to see both sides of the system. So the IPC on one side are trying to put a code in place that ensures that there's a level of scientific rigour to what they are doing, but that system is still open to abuse. So you've got the athlete side of it available to you too. There's a YouTube presentation there from the European Congress of Sports Science. That's from 2015, where the speaker gave a fairly good talk on how diversity in sport, training, equipment, ergonomics, and impairment can result in fair competition. So it's a sports science presentation about this very issue. It goes into some interesting stuff. So like how, for example, there has been progress made in the use of equipment. So for example, if we go back a couple of decades, the wheelchairs that the wheelchair racers would have used were the same hospital wheelchairs, big, bulky, heavy, difficult to maneuver, whereas over the last couple of decades they've evolved into finely tuned racing machines that are custom built to each individual athlete. So there's interesting things going on there in the background that's enhancing sports performance. Classification comes into that as well. The IPC have produced a classification code that is also going to be available to you guys on Moodle. They have committed to the development of an evidence-based system for classification. So no longer just the opinion, it has to have be evidence-based. This came into effect in January 2017, and from January 2018, all NPCs, National Paralympic Committees, had to be compliant with the IPC classification code. What this code also strives to do, which was a major issue before, is it's committed to the development of evidence-based classification systems so that athletes who enhance their competitive performance, so enhance their ability to perform through effective training, will not be moved into a class with athletes who have less activity limitation, as they would in the older style of system, but instead they will be rewarded by being more competitive within the class in which they were originally allocated. So that was a problem. You had athletes who were training really, really hard. Particularly, I know personally a couple of athletes with cerebral palsy who trained themselves so well that the symptoms of their cerebral palsy were minimized, and then they were reclassified and put into a different category. So that seems unfair. Instead of being rewarded by being more competitive in their classification, they were moved into a different group where instead of being towards the top, they were now towards the bottom again, because they were competing against people who were starting off in a different functional capacity. So this is to try and eliminate that. They're committed to ensuring through their evidence-based system that athletes get to stay in their original class where it is deemed appropriate. So what are the steps in getting classified? So all athletes are classified by classifiers. So we've mentioned them before. We've got our medical and our technical classifiers. And there's 3 questions that that group of classifiers must answer about the athlete. 1, does the athlete have an eligible impairment for this sport? 2, does the athlete's eligible impairment meet the minimum criteria for the sport? And 3, which sport class describes the athlete's activity limitation most accurately? So we'll look at each one of those in a little bit more detail now. First, the eligible impairments. So we mentioned in one of our previous lectures there are 10 classes of impairments that an athlete may have. So first of all, we have to determine, does the athlete have one of these 10 eligible impairments? Impaired muscle power, impaired passive range of movement, a limb deficiency, a leg length difference, short stature, hypertonia, ataxia, athetosis, visual impairment, or intellectual impairment. Don't worry if some of those are not familiar to you now. We are going to go through them in more detail when we look at the specific impairments in the rest of this module. Not all sports include opportunities for all impairment types. So although there are 10 types of impairments there, not all sports will have a competition class for an athlete with all disabilities. And it's important to note that this is a prerequisite for competition. It is not the sole criteria on how the person is determined to be eligible. So it is a prerequisite. You must have one of these 10 as a starting point for your classification process. If you don't have these, the process stops and there's no more. If you are defined, you then go on to look at the minimum disability criteria. So each sports classification rules each sports classification rules describe how severe an eligible impairment must be for an athlete to be considered eligible to compete. So there's a minimal level of eligibility. That's what they're called. These are called the minimum impairment criteria. These ensure that the athlete's eligible impairment affects them to the extent to which the athlete is able to execute specific tasks and activities fundamental to the sport. So examples, that sounds like a very complicated way of describing things, but examples of this minimum impairment criteria include a maximum height allowed for athletes whose impairment is short stature. So there's a height limitation for those athletes. Or the level of an amputation defined for athletes with a limb deficiency. So where is your amputation? And in certain cases, they will go and measure the length of the limb that is left to determine, like, how far below the elbow is the arm amputation, how low below the knee, how far above the knee is the amputation. Again, this should be based on the basis of scientific research, and the minimum impairment or minimum disability criteria is sport specific, so it will change from sport to sport. Okay, so once an athlete is identified as having one of the 10, once they've had their minimal impairment criteria established, they are then allocated into a sport class. So after they've got the other two, the athlete is determined to be eligible for the sport. The sport class the athlete is going to be competing will be identified, and then they'll be allocated a category defined from the International Federation which oversees that sport. So there are variations from sport to sport. So in some classes there's only one sport class. For example, powerlifting. We'll have a look at that in a moment. On the other hand, due to the different disciplines like running, jumping and throwing, and because the sport includes all 10 of the eligible impairments, Paralympic athletics has over 50 different sports classes. So it gets complicated. The idea of the sports class is that it groups athletes together who have a similar activity limitation for competition, so they can compete equitably. This again means that the sports classes are different by sport, and it also means that sport classes do not necessarily comprise athletes with the same eligible impairment. That's important to note. So if the different impairments cause the same functional limitation, you can have athletes with different impairments grouped together because functionally they're classified as being similar. So, for example, in wheelchair racing events on the track, you'll often see athletes with paraplegia competing, so the athletes who are paralysed from the waist down, competing with athletes who have had leg amputations. So they have similar functional ability in their working body and their impairment affects their legs. They both use a wheelchair to race, but they have different impairments. One has a spinal cord injury, one has an amputation, but you will see them competing side by side. Determining which sport class the athlete should compete in is a multi-stage process, and it will consist of a physical and technical assessment followed by observation and competition before a final class is allocated, and a sports class status is designated to the athlete. So this is a long process. It's a multi-stage process in order to get the athlete classified, and I know from working with certain athletes the classification process can be very, very stressful. So, as we said there's an athlete evaluation at the end of this process. So there's a physical assessment, technical assessment, and observation during competition. Athletes may be classified a number of times during their career. If they have a disability that may progressively get worse, they may be classified multiple times, where they'll be put into a more severe category as their disability progresses. On the other hand, then, if they want to change sport, they may need to be classified to compete in a different sport or to compete in a different event. Also, if for some reason their medical conditions change, they may have to be reclassified. So it is a stressful process because there's a lot going on in it. But the idea of the process is that it is rigorous, that it is science-based, that it is sport-specific, and that it creates a level playing field for the athletes. You can find out, we're only skimming the surface of it here, you can find out a lot more about it by going to paralympics.org and paralympic.org and looking at the classification info for sports that you might be interested in. Okay, so let's talk about identification of sports classes. So there's a couple of different ways in which the sports classes are identified. First of all, we've got a letter and a number qualification, and this is done in most individual sports. So for example, swimming, athletics, skiing, bocce or goalball. You might see an athlete who's designated S4 in swimming, could be T34 in athletics. Now, I'm not going to go down through them all, but what that means, say for the T4 in athletics, T refers to an athlete who competes on the track, as opposed to F34 is an athlete who competes in field sports, and the 34 is their functional disability class. So a T34 athlete is a track athlete who has a certain functional impairment. That's what they are. That might be different from an S4 in swimming. We'll look at swimming as a more in an in-depth example now in a second. So in swimming, we have a letter number combination. S as the prefix refers to an athlete who competes in the freestyle, the butterfly and the backstroke events. SB is specific to the breaststroke because the breaststroke requires a different functional ability than the other three strokes there: freestyle, butterfly and backstroke. Breaststroke requires different movement patterns, very different movement patterns, so athletes may have to be classified separately for the breaststroke. And then SM is for an athlete to compete in the individual medley, which is the combination event where there's multiple strokes in one race. Then we have a number, the number that comes after it. So it goes from S1 or SB1 down to S10 or SB10, and that indicates the level of the athlete's physical impairment. In swimming, a lower number indicates a more severe activity limitation than a higher number. So an athlete who's designated as an S1 are the most severely affected athletes. These are swimmers who normally use a wheelchair outside the pool and will have a very significant physical disability. Athletes who are designated S10 have the minimal physical impairment required to be eligible as a Paralympic swimmer. These might include the loss of a hand or some movement restriction in one hip joint. So they meet the minimum criteria in S10 versus S1, who are the most severely disabled. And then obviously we've got a scale of a range in between of disabilities from S2 to S9 that fit in the middle there. In swimming there, we also have athletes who compete with a visual impairment, so they have their own classification. We have either S or SB 11, 12 or 13 for athletes who have visual impairment. Obviously, again, the lower the score, the more visually impaired they are. So SB11 have no visual acuity and or no light perception. They're technically blind. So whereas someone who's in S or 13 or SB13 have the least severe visual impairment, and they might actually compete wearing blackout goggles to remove any any extra vision that they might have. Finally, then we've got S14 or SB14, and that's the classification for athletes with an intellectual impairment. So we have swimmers who compete with an intellectual impairment, which means that they might have no ability to recognize patterns, sequences, difficulty with their memory, slow reaction times, or a combination of this, which can impact on sports performance in general. So that's a kind of an overview of swimming. S or SB or SM is the letter. Then we have a number combination to determine their classification and give an idea of their level of disability, going from 1 all the way up to 14, and each one has a different designation. There are other sports where we have just a letter that uses the score. So there are only a few cases where we might have Class A and Class B athletes. So a good example of that is wheelchair fencing. Category A athletes have good trunk control. Their fencing arm is fully functional. They may have lower limb deficiency or paraplegia, and they may not use a wheelchair in daily life. Category B athletes, they have an impairment that affects the legs as well as the trunk or the fencing arm. They have some or incomplete tetraplegia, and their trunk movements are supported by the non-fencing arm. So they'll hold on to something to support them because they don't have that good trunk control. There are other sports where there is just a number score. This is typically the case in team sports. So for example, in wheelchair basketball, we've either 1 through 4, or wheelchair rugby, they have it from 0.5 to 3.5. There's a maximum number of points available on the play of field per team. So each athlete will be given a score in wheelchair basketball, for example, from 1 to 4, and at any one time the team is allowed to have a combined score of 14 on the pitch or on the court. So that means you'll have a mix of athletes with different disabilities and on the field, but it should balance out. Wheelchair rugby, the maximum score is 8, and the athletes are given a score of 0.5 to 3.5. And then getting towards the end, we have, as we mentioned, sports where athletes are either eligible or not eligible. So this is used where there's only one class, open class sports like powerlifting. So you're either eligible to compete or not in powerlifting, and after that they are grouped according to weight, as they would in able-bodied sport. It's Paralympic weightlifting is only the bench press. That's all they compete in, and it's open to anyone with a minimum level of disability but who can extend their arms to within 20 degrees of full extension during the lifts. Another example outside of this is Paralympic ice sledge hockey, which I am not familiar with at all. So within most sports, athletes will hold one sport class except for swimming and athletics. In swimming, there may have, as we mentioned, the different strokes have different technique requirements, which may mean that the athlete's impairment might affect them differently, moving from one stroke to the other. So a separate class is given for breaststroke, and you might have one athlete who has one classification for breaststroke and a different classification for freestyle. And also in athletics, we've mentioned that the letter number designation there differs compared to relevant to whether you compete on the track or fields. So you'll have track athletes will be T followed by a number, and field athletes will be F followed by a number. Athletes can hold multiple sports classes if they participate in more than one sport, but they'll have to be classified in each of them. Okay, we're going to finish with a short video on classification.
In the Paralympic Games, the classification system is essential, as it defines which athletes can compete in which sports. Athletes are divided into classes based on how their impairment affects them on the field of play, in order to allow fair competition. If you're new to classification, it can help to think of why men almost always compete against men and women almost always compete against women. Or think of it in similar terms to how boxing at the Olympic Games works, where athletes compete in different weight categories, like flyweight or heavyweight. As each sport at the Paralympic Games requires different skills and competencies, the impact of impairment on the performance of the athletes varies. That's why each sport has its own unique classification rules. Some sports feature a wide variety of impairments. In both athletics and swimming, athletes with physical, visual and intellectual impairments compete. Other sports feature fewer types of impairment. For example, only athletes with a visual impairment take part in judo and five-a-side football at the Games. Athletics has the most number of classes due to the number of different running, jumping and throwing events, and the wide variety of athletes that can compete in the sport. In contrast, shooting only has 2 classes. Each athlete competing at a Paralympic Games has already gone through an evaluation to determine their class. This evaluation is conducted by authorized technical officials called classifiers, who are appointed by the International Federation for that sport. This is a long-term, ongoing process which takes place at all major events, before and during competition. It ensures that the athletes are confident they are competing against each other on a level playing field. Classification won't get in the way of your enjoyment as a spectator, and will also help you further appreciate the ability and the performance of the athletes. The Paralympics is not about the impairments. It's all about elite sport. Let the Games begin.
So yeah, he nicely sums up a lot of what I was saying there. So we'll just finish. Just to recap there, classification ensures, the purpose of the classification is to ensure that winning is determined by athletic skill, fitness, power, endurance, technical ability, and the mental focus. And it's not about the disability of the athlete. It's about their ability to perform at the highest level on an equal playing field with their competitors. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks very much for your attention. I will catch you in the next lecture.